This video is all about the 1.5-year journey of building my Mandalorian kit. It all started with a dream of having a high quality custom Mando costume, but there was one problem. I had never made a cosplay before. How difficult can it really be? This has been by far the most expensive and the most time-consuming video I have ever made. And even though I made almost everything from scratch, the total sum of this project ended up being over 2,000 euros. It hurts just to say that out loud, honestly. Was it worth it? And did I achieve an actually good-looking Mando kit? Before we can actually answer those questions, we should go back to how it all started. So, I bought this helmet. I figured that if I put money into the helmet, that will force me to complete the rest of it too. And I suppose it worked. I got started with the design process. I ditched the colors and went for a color scheme of dark grey, white and black. I included an amount of Easter eggs and odes to different things in Star Wars, but you'll get to see those later in the video. And this is the design I ended up choosing, at least for the time being. Next, I put in an order at Avela Armory on Etsy for a pair of gauntlets and 2 Westar 35s. The price tag was way too much since shipping to Finland plus customs is just crazy, but oh well. I mean, I already bought the helmet, I kind of had to go through with it now. After that, I found boots and a belt from thrift shops, so that luckily didn't cost me much. But then the project stalled for months. Everything just felt overwhelmingly difficult. Where do you even start? I have never done anything even close to this. I think this sauna water spoon is the nicest thing I've ever crafted before. And let me tell you, it's a lot simpler than a Mando. To make it a bit easier for myself, I divided the process into 3 different stages. 1. Planning and preparation, 2. Assembly, and 3. Painting. I think what I need to do now is to look what I've already done and what I still need to do before I can move on to stage number 2. At this point I was missing the flight suit, flak vest, gloves, holsters and the armor plates. I wrote a list of everything I would be needing and I found places I could get those things. After that I was ready to move on to the next stage, which was the assembly. So essentially, make Mando armor using this stuff. Easy, right? It's smartest to start with the flight suit and flak vest, the so-called soft parts. There are many ways to go about making them, but I decided to do everything from scratch with the help of my aunt. First up was the flak vest, and for this my aunt used some of the old patterns for the Star Wars inspired dress that she made for me that I also made a video about previously. After the patterns were made and the pieces were cut, it was time to sew them together. And since I'm not the sewing expert, I can't really say much else about the process except here is the final vest. It's opened on the right side with some velcro and the shoulder caps are reinforced with a thin piece of something. I'm not exactly sure what that is either, but it works well. Next up was the pants. We used one of my aunt's own patterns for leggings and modified that pattern to fit my body. Meanwhile, the vest is not stretchy at all. The fabric we used for this is a bit stretchier. It didn't take that long to make and it turned out great too. And there is a hidden zipper on the right side. Out of that same fabric, my aunt also made the shirt that goes under the vest. It had to include a specific neckline and a double sleeve, and she also added some extra stitching details on the sleeves to make the double sleeve stand out a bit more. The shirt is fastened in the front with velcro. And there we have the finished soft parts. Not so difficult when you have a pro who knows what she's doing. Up next was the leather work. And I first looked online, but I would have had to pay over 200 for a ready set of holsters, plus shipping and customs. So I decided to make them myself. Here are the scraps that I got. Now what I just have to do is to figure out what kind of holster I want to make. I went through the whole process of making a blueprint for the holster, but after 2 hours of struggle I came to the conclusion that I simply do not have enough material. Or I have enough material, but the area is not like big enough for one piece. After getting a bigger piece of leather, I could actually start the process by measuring how long the tie straps had to be. Then I double checked that the template I previously made would work. Out of all the raw materials, leather is by far the most expensive. Let's see what happens. This was one of the moments where you just had to take the leap and cut into that leather, risking messing it up and having to buy another sheet for another 50 euros. To minimize the risk of that, I double checked that the fit was good before cutting out the second holster and the straps. I didn't want it to look unfinished or all too amateur, so I used some sandpaper, first 120 and then 400 grit on all of the edges. When they were nice and smooth, I added some edge coloring to finish them off nicely. The difference was noticeable and definitely worth the effort. Then I recruited Strike to help me with connecting the straps.
So these are rivets and those are snaps, and this holds the holster to the leg.
To attach these, you first need to punch holes through the leather and then use a specific tool and a hammer to fasten them. The rivets are just 2 pieces smashed together, while the snaps have a total of 4 pieces, so here you have to be careful to connect the right pieces to each other.
After that, I took some leather glue and glued the edges that would be sewn together later. I left them clamped down overnight and it worked absolutely fantastic. It might actually have been a good thing that the glue didn't work, since when I punched the holes for stitching through the leather, I had to fold open the holster so I could punch the holes in the second layer properly as well. Then it was time to figure out how to do the saddle stitch. I followed a couple of tutorials and figured it out pretty quickly, and honestly the hardest part was threading the needle, but the stitching itself was pretty fun and I started to get pretty fast in the end. And I have decided that I'm going to also try to sew this part, which is going to be the thing that goes around the belt. It's going to be a bit more difficult, but I think I can do it. Punching the holes was very straightforward again. The stitching was a bit harder. Holding the piece was more difficult this time around since I wasn't stitching an edge. But eventually I figured that out too, and even how to lock the thread properly on the needle. And I am really happy with the end result. I mean, that's pretty good, right? After this, I did a quick test fit and everything looked great. The last part of the process was to water form the leather to make it look more like the blaster is actually supposed to fit in there. After dunking the holster in water, I pressed against the edges of the blaster inside it. Then I left the holster to dry overnight with the blasters inside them. Remember when I said I decided to make my own holsters to save money? Since I've never worked with leather before, I ended up having to buy 120 euros worth of tools. And then I bought a kilo of black leather scraps, and then I needed some more tools and a bigger sheet of leather. So yeah, in the end I spent more than I would have for a already ready set of holsters. Well, at least I know how to make holsters now. Next up is the assembly of the blasters and the gauntlets. These are raw resin prints, so they were in need of a little bit of sanding. First around with soapy water and 400 grit sandpaper, and then it was time to attach some of the pieces. But before that, some of them had to be filed to actually fit properly, and Strike was a big help here. I would do it, but I'm not strong enough. Once that was done, we could attach the different parts. So now we are going to use this epoxy glue. Thanks to JT for letting us know how to use this kind of stuff. I was scared I would do something wrong, so Strike got to handle the gluing. We also glued some small springs to the triggers.
So now it just needs to cure for 12 hours and then we'll check on it again. And hopefully nothing failed.
The glue worked perfectly, but some work had to be done on the springs.
And as you can see, there is this gap, so that's why we had to shorten it. You can pull the trigger now.
Then all of the parts got a coat of filler primer and a round of wet sanding. Strike helped me to get the last corners I wasn't able to get sanded. Then I put another coat of filler primer and sanding that once more with a very fine grade sandpaper. But the sanding wasn't over yet. Not even close. That's because the next 3D printed obstacle to tackle was the helmet, which was supposed to arrive ready to paint.
Which it wasn't, and it also came with these 2 pieces of joke. So before we put like a bunch of hours of work into trying to make this work, I'm actually going to now try and make those 2 pieces out of wood.
So I did, and it turned out pretty good.
This meant I could start sanding. One of the biggest problems I had was to find out what products I needed. For example, everyone is always talking about Mando, but that simply doesn't exist in Finland. A fellow Finnish Star Wars fan, Marietta, helped me to track down the products that I was searching for. By the way, you should check out her stuff on Instagram, she makes absolutely incredible things. She recommended a wood filler type of thing. It needs about 24 hours to dry and becomes completely hard and sandable. So this is what it looks like after I put the wood filling stuff on it yesterday. Then followed a process of using the wood filler, sanding, using filler primer, sanding, and repeat. Mainly what I had to work on was the underside, so the edges of the helmet and visor, the earpieces, and the underside of the sort of band in the back. This process was repeated a couple of times, and then we glued the wooden earpiece with epoxy adhesive to the helmet. That was also then covered in wood filler, and then it was time to sand again. I should have put the earpiece on a bit earlier, because now this is the only part that still needs sanding and more filler stuff. That was a bit of a fail, but it's okay. The sanding and filling process had to be repeated a couple of times since the gaps between the helmet and the earpiece were quite big. But once that was all done, I could move on to the last step, which was a coat of filler primer and a last pass of sandpaper with a very fine grit. Then we get to the last big part we need to complete before moving on to stage 3, and that part is making the armor plates. There is a handful of different materials you can use to make your armor. I decided to go with foam PVC board because it is fairly easy to work with, but it's still very durable. People often refer to this material as sintra, but that's actually just the name of one specific brand. You can't get that easily here in Finland, so instead I got something named Forex. To get the templates for the armor, I wrapped plastic wrap over my body when I was wearing the flight suit and vest. I then covered the plastic wrap in painter's tape and drew outlines of where the armor would be. I enlisted my dad for help to do the same for the backplate. After carefully cutting off the tape of the plastic contraption, I had a template for the size of my chest and back, which I used as an outline to draw the actual templates. Those were then used to transfer the outlines of the armor onto the PVC board. I tried to cut them out with a box cutter, but I was not strong enough. My dad was able to do it, but it was really difficult, so we opted for a different solution and used a handsaw machine thingy to cut out the pieces. We learned as we went and had to redo some plates. It was also a good idea to secure the board to the table. Who would have thought? Next up, we filed down and sanded the edges. My dad started this process, and then once Strike came to Finland, I put him to work on it. Both of them did a great job, and I could never have finished that on my own.
I think it went pretty well. Proud of how those edges here came out. Yeah, I think it actually turned out pretty well.
Thank you! The next part was heat forming. For this we took out the heat gun and we started at lower temperatures, but by the end the heat gun was at 450 degrees Celsius. After a piece was formed, we sprayed it with cold water to cool it down and prevent the shape from deforming. Strike did all the work, started doing this in the evening at sunset, so at a certain point we had to bring out the extra light to be able to continue working. You could see the armor actually take shape in front of your eyes, and that's what made it so fun.
I would say a very successful session, and yeah, ready to paint.
No, not quite.
Almost.
We need to attach it first.
Right.
So, attaching it was. First we looked at what would be good placements for snaps and where we would be putting Velcro. We were using E6000 glue and clamping it down and letting it stay like that for 24 hours. The Velcro already had adhesive on it, so for attaching that I just cut out fitting pieces and placed them on the spots that we had planned out. And that makes the armor actually ready to be primed and painted. But before that we need to use them to see where the attaching point is going to be on the vest and the flight suit. To do it, we marked the tips of the snaps with chalk and also used the chalk to draw outlines where the Velcro should be. Then I used my aunt's sewing machine to sew the Velcro while Strike got to hand sew the snaps. The Velcro on the lower legs for the shin armor was super difficult. First I sewed the leg shut, so then I tried to hand sew it. It took ages and didn't look good in the end. I gave the machine a second go, and after having to redo it at least 3 times, I managed to make it okay at least. Then we did the first test fit of all the armor, and well, the chest plates were placed way too low and it just didn't look good at all. The vest also looked way too loose, so we had to go to my aunt again and redo the placement of the chest pieces and make the vest tighter. The pants also didn't stay down as well as I would have liked to, so I added some elastic bands at the ends that would go inside the shoe and under my feet. In combination with this visit to my aunt, I also made the sash that would go under the belt. I sewed together 2 strips of black fabric and I turned it inside out and put velcro on the ends. We also had to redo the collar piece that just didn't look right. Here we have it. As you can see, the shape is a bit different. After a successful second test fit, it was finally time to move on to the stage I had been waiting for, the painting. But before we get started, I think this would be a fantastic moment for you to blast that like button. The first thing I painted were test pieces with the colors I was intending to use, but this was a bit wasted time because of what would happen later. After I painted the inside of the helmet black, it was time for the spray painting to begin. I started with a silver layer on the blasters and gauntlets while the armor plates all got primed. The edges are looking kind of weird, so I might have to sand these over with like some fine sandpaper and see what happens. So that's what I did. The sanding is working quite good, and I mean, as you can see, the primer didn't stick that well to it, and I mean that's exactly why I'm priming. So after the sanding of the edges is done, I'm gonna put another layer of primer. But before that, I took out my blasters and put some masking tape on the spots I wanted to stay silver. This took a surprising amount of time and it was not easy. Once the second layer of primer had dried, the weathering process of the armor could begin. Most of it is going to be done when the paint is all done, but some of it we have to do right now, which is to create some small actual scratches in the armor with various different sharp things. After testing the tools on a scrap piece, I started adding some light scratches and texture to the armor and helmet. I made sure to follow the rules of realistic weathering and really thinking about what piece I was working on and where and how much that piece would be hit. And at this point, the whole concept of my Mandalorian had a whole identity crisis. As a refresher, this is the initial design I came up with at the very beginning of this project. Even though I liked it, I wasn't so sure about it anymore. I talked about it with Strike and asked him to do a design for me. He incorporated the old idea but gave it some color, which is just what I was after. I really loved his design, and after doing a couple of changes, it really felt like a fresh version of my original design. So I went with it. That means we are ready for the first actual layer of paint. The first layer would be silver. The silver paint has dried and it is looking pretty good, except of one spot where some sort of fly died, I guess. Anyway, what I will be doing now is I will be taking some white toothpaste and I'm going to be masking off the areas that I want to stay silver. I actually quite enjoyed painting on the toothpaste, and at times I had to wipe some of it off because I went too overboard with it. Then it was time for the first color layer. For this one I went with a light blue with some cyan undertones. To make a cool overlay effect, I painted everything with both this blue and also a lighter layer of a blue that was a bit darker. I had also masked certain spots between these two blues just to add some more detail into the chipping effect. The next layer of paint was the black. First I had to mask off all the areas that would stay blue, and in this case there were a lot. The chest plates were really difficult since they had to be symmetrical. Gauntlets were a bit easier. One of the undersides got a spontaneous new design element just because I thought it looked cool. And with the helmet, only the ear caps would be black, so I masked them off and put a bag over the rest of it. After this, I put some toothpaste in the areas that would be getting painted. I wanted to do some paint chipping effects on the black parts, letting small parts of the blue paint show through, showing some of the history of the armor. At this point I also painted the blasters, and after the paint was touch dry I removed the masking tape. At certain spots the black had bled through the edges and it wasn't as clean as I wanted, but overall it was still okay. I was able to scrape some of the excess black off with water and a toothpick. And this is the only part of this entire process that I didn't film, but maybe he'll survive without that footage. I cleaned up the edges by putting some black acrylic paint on with a small brush. Next I put masking tape on the helmet for the white parts. I eyeballed it. I was thinking of making a blueprint but thought that would be harder than just putting the tape on. I also didn't want it to be perfectly symmetrical. After I added more toothpaste, it was time to spray paint. The gauntlets also got another layer of black in some spots I had initially left silver but now wanted to cover. This time I did 2 lighter coats instead of 1 thicker one. This worked well and I was able to remove the masking tape, revealing some beautiful crisp lines. I was also going to make a stencil for the sigil on the shoulder, but we didn't really have the right paper, so it didn't work. Instead, Strike came up with the idea of making small dots on the paper, then spraying it with white, and after that being able to hand paint the sigil. This honestly worked pretty well. I had to mix my own color because the white on the helmet was not completely white, and I ended up dropping the brush on the black and couldn't remove the stain. Otherwise, it turned out good. After the white on the helmet was dry, I painted on some Mando text. I used an old eyeliner brush to be able to make all those small letters. If you're curious to what it means, I'm going to eventually explain all of the little details in another video. At this point the blasters were also dry, so I used that same brush and some silver paint to paint on some scratches on the blasters. This was really fun to do, but I had to be careful not to overdo it. Then it was time to remove the toothpaste. I did this with a wet rag and sponges. Some of the spots were really stuck and I had to use a sharper tool to get toothpaste off. But overall there was no problem and paint chipping effect turned out really good. Now I'm going to add a bit of silver paint in some of these spots where the silver didn't really come through as much as I would like it to. After this, I weathered the soft parts. First, I took a spray bottle with a little bit of water, put in some white, brown and black acrylic paint and mixed it properly, and then sprayed that on the soft parts. And it looked okay at first, but once it dried you honestly couldn't see much. But not to worry, I had an old cheap eyeshadow palette with a lot of good black, brown and grey tones, which I put onto all the soft parts with a makeup brush. I focused a lot on the seams and especially the bottom of the pants. I then sprayed the weathered spots with some clear coat so that the powder would stay in place, and I think I managed to get a quite good look. It's subtle but still looks a bit dirty and dusty when you take a closer look. Then it was time for the weathering of the armor plates, blasters and helmet. First I scratched the surface a bit with 60 grit sandpaper, and then used some finer sandpaper in some other spots. Then I created some different washes of acrylic paint and water, and I put that onto the armor with a brush. I first used a wet rag to remove some of the paint and then a dry one or a paper towel to dry the spots. I did both mud layers of brown and more black or grey washes, and I was focusing on deep set areas like crevices because that's where realistically dirt and mud would settle. I mainly put harsher washes and mud coloration on the shins and knees, simply because that's the parts where there realistically would be more mud and I didn't want my entire armor to be crazy weathered. When I was happy with the weathering, it was time for a clear coat. But before that, I wanted to try adding some of that same makeup powder I used on the soft parts. I put on a bit of browns, blacks, white and even blue on the blue parts. Then I took a bigger brush to get some of the excess off. I got a pretty nice effect and I especially like how it looks on the black pieces because I had struggled a bit before how to make them look weathered like the rest of the armor. After that I sprayed on the clear coat in hopes that would make the powder stay. Then I painted all the backsides black. I did this in case some of the backsides would be visible in certain poses or in motion. Meanwhile Strike was gluing the triggers in place. Then the visor I had ordered arrived. Turns out they sent me the wrong one. I got the Bo-Katan Black Series replacement visor instead of the custom Night Owl visor. Obviously we couldn't install it the way it was supposed to with screws that are already in the Black Series helmet, so we tried to use some epoxy putty, but...
Well, that didn't work, but We got screws, so let's try that.
I had to saw the screws down a bit so they would fit. I then used the visor to mark the spots for the screws that were first glued with super glue. I then added some 2-component epoxy adhesive to make sure it's secure. The next day it was time to put the visor in place and fasten the screws. The last thing we did was to put some padding inside the helmet. I used some ice hockey helmet padding to get the shape and cut them out. We decided not to glue them since they will eventually be replaced and they stay in place quite well as it is. And that means the helmet is done.
And not just the helmet, but the entire kit. I think it's about time to see that final reveal.
What the hell, bro? What the fuck?
It's incredible to see that I'm able to create something like this. If you want to learn how to do it and also to avoid some of the mistakes I did that ended up costing me a lot of extra money, then I would recommend you sign up to my email list linked in the description, since that's where I share everything first. May the force be with you.
Always.
Bye bye.
Press it! Press it!